Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Heartfelt Tales, where the pulse of human drama beats louder than ever, right here, right now, on this very screen. Buckle up, because today we're diving headfirst into a story that'll grip your soul and shake your senses, a tale of brilliance ignored, arrogance unleashed, and a nation teetering on the edge of chaos. This isn't just another video, it's a roller coaster of revelations packed with jaw-dropping twists, raw emotion, and lessons that hit harder than a freight train. From the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., to the dark underbelly of a cyber catastrophe, we've got it all, every gritty detail, every heart-pounding moment. But here's the catch, this is no quick skim. It's a deep dive, loaded with information you won't want to miss, so stick with us to the very end to catch the full scope of this electrifying saga. If you're ready to feel the heat, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below. Tell us what you think as we unravel this one. Let's get started, because at Heartfelt Tales, we don't just tell stories, we make you feel them. Part 1, Opening. David Chen stepped out of the faded yellow taxi, his polished leather shoes clicking against the damp sidewalk of Washington, D.C. It was March 22, 2025, and the morning air carried the sharp chill of spring, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee wafting from a nearby shop. He adjusted his deep blue tie, took a deep breath to steady himself, and headed toward the entrance of the Department of Homeland Security building. In his hand was a worn black leather briefcase, his constant companion, filled with critical documents he'd been preparing for weeks. Today, he'd been invited to an urgent meeting to discuss emerging cybersecurity threats, and he knew what he was about to present could shift the government's perspective on the current situation. But he also had a gut feeling that not everyone in the room ahead would welcome him with open arms. David Chen was no stranger to high-stakes situations like this. At 45, he had earned a reputation as one of the world's leading cybersecurity experts. Born to Chinese immigrant parents in a modest Chicago suburb, David grew up amid his family's struggles. His father toiled in an electronics factory, while his mother worked tirelessly as a seamstress. From a young age, he'd been fascinated by the clunky old computers his father brought home from the plant, and by 12, he was teaching himself to code simple games. His talent didn't go unnoticed, propelling him to a scholarship at MIT and later a string of prestigious roles in tech and cybersecurity. The pinnacle of David's career came in 2017 when he was tapped as a senior cybersecurity advisor for the Trump administration. During his tenure, he played a key role in thwarting numerous cyber attacks from state-sponsored hackers, including one that nearly crippled the national power grid. He wasn't one for the spotlight. Former colleagues remembered him as a quiet man, always in a plain white dress shirt, spending hours in meeting rooms poring over data. But his work left a lasting mark, even if not everyone acknowledged it after the administration changed hands. After leaving the White House in 2021, David transitioned to independent consulting, advising major tech firms and occasionally collaborating with international agencies to track global cyber threats. He lived a low-key life in a small Virginia apartment, spending most of his time reading, researching, and playing chess with his 10-year-old son. But the invitation to today's meeting had pulled him back into the center of high-stakes decisions, and he couldn't refuse, not for fame, but because what he'd recently uncovered was too grave to ignore. The meeting was hosted by the Department of Homeland Security, with senior officials, technical experts, and a few Pentagon figures in attendance. The invitation had been brief, just a few lines, but David understood the context. Over the past few months, intelligence reports had flagged unusual spikes in cyber activity from groups linked to Russia and China. Some sources even warned of a potential large-scale attack targeting U.S. critical infrastructure. David had spent weeks analyzing data from international colleagues and had identified a severe vulnerability in the federal government's security systems, a gap he believed adversaries could exploit at any moment. He carried evidence, numbers, and a detailed scenario of what could happen if the flaw wasn't addressed immediately. As he stepped through the building's large glass doors, a security guard checked his credentials and escorted him to the 12th floor. The elevator chimed softly as it opened, and David entered a long, marble-lined hallway, his footsteps echoing steadily. At the end was meeting room 3, a space he'd visited a few times in the past. Pushing the door open, he immediately sensed the undercurrent of tension inside. The room was spacious, with stark white walls and a long, polished walnut conference table. Light streamed in from large windows, illuminating the faces of over a dozen people seated around it. Some wore crisp black suits, others dressed more casually, a telltale sign of the technical experts. A large screen on the wall displayed the Department of Homeland Security logo. At the head of the table, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a piercing gaze flipped through a stack of papers. David recognized him instantly, Undersecretary Harold Johnson, the meeting's chair, and a man he'd heard no shortage of unflattering rumors about. Harold Johnson, 58, was a veteran government official known for his rigid leadership style and arrogant demeanor. A former lawyer before entering politics, he'd climbed the ranks more through a vast network of connections than through raw ability. To many, Johnson epitomized the quintessential politician, always prioritizing personal and partisan interests above all else, and quick to dismiss those who didn't align with his views. He harbored a particular disdain for anyone who'd worked under the Trump administration, viewing them as relics of an era he despised. David had been warned about this by an old industry friend, but he didn't dwell on it. He was here to present facts, not to win anyone's approval. Dar. Chen, good to see you, Johnson said as David entered, though his tone lacked warmth. He offered a thin smile, his eyes scanning David as if sizing him up. I hear you were quite the figure in, well, the previous administration. Let's hope you've brought something useful for us today. David nodded slightly, brushing off the veiled jab. He set his briefcase down, pulled out a chair, and quietly surveyed the room. A few familiar faces nodded in greeting, technical experts he'd met at past conferences. But most of the others regarded him with a mix of curiosity and wariness. He knew the atmosphere here wouldn't be easy, but he was prepared. What he was about to say might stir controversy, but he was convinced it needed to be heard. As the clock struck 9 a.m., Johnson tapped the table lightly, signaling the meeting to begin. David clenched his fists under the table, taking a deep breath. He had no idea that, in the hours ahead, what he presented would be challenged not just by data or logic, but by the arrogance and bias of the man at the head of the table, a man who could determine a nation's fate with a single dismissive wave of his hand. Part 2, The Escalation of Conflict. The hum of the air conditioning filled the silence as Undersecretary Harold Johnson leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. The faint smirk on his face suggested he was already bored, though the meeting had only just begun. Around the table, laptops flickered to life, and papers rustled as attendees prepared for the discussion. Dar. David Chen opened his briefcase with a soft click, pulling out a neatly bound report and a small stack of charts. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began. Thank you all for having me here today, David said, his voice steady but measured. I've been analyzing recent intelligence reports and cross-referencing them with data from international partners. What I've found is a critical vulnerability in the security protocols of several federal agencies, a flaw that, if exploited, could compromise everything from financial systems to national defense networks. He slid the report across the table toward Johnson, who didn't bother to pick it up. Instead, the undersecretary tapped his pen against the edge of his coffee mug, the rhythmic clinking cutting through David's pause. Undeterred, David turned to the screen behind him, where a technician had already loaded his presentation. The first slide appeared, a graph showing a sharp uptick in suspicious network activity over the past 3 months, overlaid with timestamps of failed intrusion attempts. This isn't speculation, David continued, pointing to the data. These patterns match the signatures of state-sponsored hacking groups we've tracked before, groups with the resources to turn this vulnerability into a full-scale attack. Based on my experience, I'd estimate we have weeks, maybe days, before they find a way in. The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of his words settling over the group. A few technical experts leaned forward, scribbling notes, their brows furrowed in concentration. Lisa Harper, a wiry woman in her late 30s with sharp green eyes and a reputation as the department's top systems engineer, flipped through David's report with evident interest. But before anyone could respond, Johnson let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. "Come now, Dr. Chen," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're making it sound like the sky's falling. Don't you think you're being a tad dramatic? I mean, we've got entire teams monitoring these systems. If there was a real problem, don't you think we'd know about it by now?" David turned to face him, keeping his expression neutral. He'd anticipated skepticism, it came with the territory, but Johnson's dismissal carried an edge of personal disdain that was hard to ignore. "With all due respect, Undersecretary," David replied, "the teams you're referring to are stretched thin, and this vulnerability isn't something standard monitoring would catch. It's buried deep in the authentication protocols. I've seen this kind of thing before. During my time in the Trump administration, we stopped a similar exploit just in time." Johnson's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Ah, yes, the Trump days," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "I'm sure you did wonders back then, but let's not get stuck in the past, shall we? Things have changed. Our systems are more advanced now, and frankly, I'm not convinced your vintage insights are all that relevant." A murmur rippled through the room. A few officials shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between David and Johnson. The technical experts, however, remained focused on the slides, some nodding subtly as they followed David's logic. David clenched his jaw, feeling a familiar heat rising in his chest. He'd dealt with bureaucrats like Johnson before, men who cared more about winning arguments than solving problems, but that didn't make it any less frustrating. "I'm not here to debate the past," David said evenly, sliding another chart into view. This one detailed the vulnerability itself, a flaw in the encryption handshake between servers, exploitable through a sophisticated phishing attack. "This is about the present. I've run simulations with colleagues in Europe and Asia. If this gets out, we're looking at a breach that could cost billions and expose classified data. I can walk you through the technical details if you'd like." Johnson waved a hand dismissively, cutting him off. "Spare us the lecture, Doctor. I'm sure it's all very impressive on paper, but I've seen dozens of these so-called urgent threats come and go. They always turn out to be overblown. Maybe you're just trying to relive your glory days, The jab landed harder this time, and David felt his patience fraying. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice firm. "It's about the data. I've included references to recent incidents, small-scale breaches in allied countries that match this exact profile. We can ignore it, or we can act. That's your call." For a fleeting moment, Johnson seemed caught off guard, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the chart. But he quickly recovered, leaning back with a chuckle. "Well, you've got a flair for storytelling, I'll give you that. But let's not waste everyone's time with hypotheticals. We've got real priorities to discuss, like the budget review coming up next week." The shift in topic was abrupt, and it sent a ripple of unease through the room. Lisa Harper set the report down, her lips pursed as if she wanted to say something but thought better of it. A gray-haired official from the Pentagon coughed awkwardly, flipping through his own notes. The atmosphere had changed. Where there'd been curiosity, there was now hesitation. Johnson's dismissive attitude was contagious, and David could sense the group pulling back, reluctant to challenge the man in charge. Still, he pressed on. "Undersecretary, if I may," David said, his tone sharper now, "this isn't a hypothetical. I've got logs from a test exploit we ran last week, proof this can be weaponized. If you'll let me finish, I can show you exactly how it works." Johnson rolled his eyes, but before he could interrupt again, Lisa Harper spoke up. "I'd like to see it," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "If Dr. Chen's got evidence, we should at least hear him out. I've seen some of these logs myself, they're not trivial. The room froze. Johnson's head snapped toward her, his expression darkening, but Lisa held his gaze, unfazed. A few others nodded in agreement, quietly, almost reluctantly, but it was enough to shift the momentum. David seized the moment, clicking to the next slide, a step-by-step breakdown of the test exploit, complete with timestamps and error codes. He walked them through it methodically, his voice steady despite the undercurrent of frustration. Here's where it starts, he said, pointing to a line of code. A phishing email bypasses the first layer of defense. Once the user clicks, it triggers a backdoor that exploits the handshake flaw. From there, it's a straight shot to the server. In our test, it took less than 10 minutes to gain full access. The technical details seemed to resonate with the experts in the room. A young analyst in the corner scribbled furiously, while an older man with a buzz cut, likely from the Pentagon, leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Even Johnson couldn't ignore the shift in attention, though his scowl deepened. He tapped his pen faster now, the sound growing more insistent. 10 minutes, you say? Johnson interjected, his tone skeptical. Sounds like a convenient little demo. Did you cook this up just for us, Dr. Chen? I mean, really, 10 minutes to bring down the government? You should write a movie script. A few nervous laughs echoed around the table, but they were half-hearted. David met Johnson's gaze, his patience wearing thin but his resolve unshaken. It's not a demo, he said, his voice low and deliberate. It's a warning. And if you think this is a joke, I'd be happy to run it live right now, on a sandbox server, of course. You can see for yourself. The challenge hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Johnson's smirk faltered, his fingers pausing mid-tap. For the first time, he didn't have an immediate retort. The room held its breath, waiting for his response, and David stood there, unflinching, knowing he'd just drawn a line in the sand. Part 3, Climax. The silence in the meeting room was thick, pressing down on everyone present like a heavy blanket. The tapping of Undersecretary Harold Johnson's pen had stopped entirely, but his piercing gaze remained fixed on Dr. David Chen. David's challenge, to run a live attack simulation on a sandbox server, hung in the air, a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples no one dared to break. The officials around the table exchanged subtle glances, while the technical experts seemed to hold their breath, awaiting the response from the man in charge. Johnson cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim his confidence. A live demo, you say? He remarked, his tone tinged with mockery but lacking its earlier certainty. I'm not sure we have time for your little tech games, Dr. Chen. But if you're so confident, go ahead. Just don't expect me to applaud when you're done. David ignored the sarcasm. He nodded to Lisa Harper, who had quietly risen and moved to the laptop connected to the large screen. She typed a few swift commands, setting up a sandbox environment, a simulated, isolated system for testing without risking the real network. David pulled a small USB drive from his briefcase, plugged it in, and began working. His hands moved deftly across the keyboard, but his voice remained calm, almost detached. This is the scenario I mentioned, he said, eyes locked on the screen. I'll simulate a phishing attack targeting the vulnerability in the authentication protocol. You'll see it unfold in real time. Lisa, can you monitor the system logs to verify? Lisa nodded, her eyes gleaming with intense focus. I'm ready, she replied, her fingers dancing over her own keyboard. Numbers and lines of code began streaming across her secondary screen, syncing with David's actions. On the main screen, a fake email appeared, an innocuous message mimicking the internal notices federal employees receive daily. The subject read, Urgent Update, System Password Reset, complete with a link to a web page designed to resemble the Department of Homeland Security's official portal. David clicked the link, and instantly, a cascade of code scrolled across the screen, signaling the attack start. "This is step 1, David explained, his voice even. "The email bypasses spam filters because it uses a trusted IP address, something hackers could steal from a contractor or compromised employee. When the user clicks, it triggers hidden code." The screen flickered, and a new window opened, showing the code's progress as it exploited the handshake protocol flaw. Commands scrolled by almost too fast to read, but David paused at a critical point. "This is where the vulnerability kicks in," he said, pointing to a bold red line of code. "The system fails to properly validate the server's certificate, letting an attacker impersonate it and access sensitive data." In less than 5 minutes, the screen flashed a message, "Access granted." Another window popped up, displaying a list of simulated files, classified documents, banking details, military data, all within the attacker's reach. David turned to Johnson, his gaze unwavering. "In this test, I stop here. But in a real scenario, they could download everything, install malware, or even lock the entire system." The room erupted in hushed murmurs. Lisa Harper looked up from her screen, her voice trembling slightly with a mix of excitement and alarm. "I've checked the logs, everything he's saying checks out. This vulnerability grants access without triggering any alerts. If this happened for real, we wouldn't know until it was too late." Johnson let out a loud, forced laugh, but it sounded dry and hollow. "Really? A neat little show," he said, struggling to maintain his composure. "I'm sure you've rehearsed this a dozen times, haven't you? But don't expect me to believe the whole country's going to collapse over some silly email. You're exaggerating, Dr. Chen, something a guy stuck in the past like you tends to do." The words cut like a knife, but David didn't flinch. He stepped closer to the table, resting both hands on its cold wooden surface and locking eyes with Johnson. "I'm not exaggerating," he said, his voice low but powerful, resonating through the room. "I have evidence from an actual attack in Germany last month, same vulnerability, same method. They lost millions of euros and sensitive data to hackers for 3 days before noticing. I can show you the report if you'd like. And if you think this is a joke, imagine it hitting the Pentagon's database or the Federal Reserve. Billions of dollars, millions of lives, that's the cost of ignoring this." The gravity in David's tone, paired with the chilling details he'd laid out, silenced the room. An older man with a buzz cut, likely from the Pentagon, nodded slowly, his hand tightening around his pen as if picturing the worst-case scenario. Lisa Harper pushed her chair back, stood, and pointed to her screen. "I'm with Dr. Chen," she said firmly. "This isn't theoretical, it's happened. And if we don't act, it'll happen to us." Johnson's brow furrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. He scanned the room, noticing the shift in the air. Nods of agreement from the technical experts, worried glances from a few officials, all of it worked against him. He shot up from his chair, his voice rising in frustration. "What are you all doing? Buying into his horror stories just because of some tech trick? We have other priorities, no one has time for this panic nonsense." But his words lacked their earlier weight. David stepped closer, his voice dropping but cutting like a blade. "I'm not here to cause panic, Undersecretary. I'm here to protect this country based on what I know for certain. This isn't personal opinion, it's verified analysis. You can mock my past, but you can't mock the data. And if you choose to ignore it, the cost won't just be your reputation." David's final statement hit like a punch, leaving Johnson momentarily stunned. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. For the first time in the meeting, he looked flustered, his eyes flickering between David and the others. The technical experts began whispering among themselves, a few pulling out phones to cross-check the information David had mentioned. Lisa Harper turned to him, giving a slight nod as a silent affirmation. The atmosphere in the room had transformed entirely. Johnson's arrogance could no longer drown out the truth David had exposed. The climax of the meeting wasn't just a clash of words, it was the moment when data and one man's resolve forced an entire system to confront the terrifying reality they'd tried to avoid. Part 4, Aftermath. The tension in the room lingered like smoke after a fire, heavy and acrid, as the echoes of Dr. David Chen's words settled over the group. Undersecretary Harold Johnson stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of barely concealed frustration. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening, as he struggled to regain control of a situation that had slipped through his fingers. The technical demonstration, clean, irrefutable, and damning, had stripped away his ability to dismiss David with a wave of his hand. Around the table, eyes darted between the two men, some wide with unease, others narrowed in quiet agreement with what they'd just witnessed. Johnson forced a tight smile, his voice strained as he finally spoke. "Well, Dr. Chen, you've certainly made your point," he said, the words clipped and brittle. "I'll concede that this warrants a closer look. My team will take it under advisement." He gestured vaguely toward his assistants, two young aides who scrambled to jot down notes, their pens scratching nervously against paper. But the concession lacked conviction, and his attempt to save face only highlighted his discomfort. Gone was the smug confidence he'd wielded earlier, in its place was a man cornered by facts he couldn't refute. David didn't respond immediately. He stepped back from the table, his posture relaxed but his eyes still sharp, watching Johnson with the calm intensity of someone who knew the battle was won. "I appreciate that," he said simply, his tone devoid of triumph or gloating. "I'll leave the data with you. If you need anything else, you know where to find me." He began gathering his papers, methodical and unhurried, as if the storm of the past hour had been just another day's work. But the room wasn't ready to let the moment pass so easily. Lisa Harper, still standing by her laptop, closed the lid with a decisive snap and turned to the group. "We can't just take it under advisement," she said, her voice firm and edged with urgency. "This isn't a paperwork issue, it's a ticking clock. I propose we convene a technical team immediately to start patching this vulnerability. We've got the logs, the proof, and Dr. Chen's blueprint. Let's move." Her words sparked a flurry of activity. The buzzcut Pentagon official, Colonel Mark Reynolds, as his nameplate read, nodded vigorously, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. "She's right. I've seen breaches like this cripple allies overseas. If we sit on our hands, we're begging for a disaster. I'll get my people on it, give me a secure line after this." He pulled out a phone, already scrolling through contacts. Johnson's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with irritation, but he couldn't muster a counterargument. The tide had turned, and he knew it. "Fine," he snapped, waving a hand as if to wash his hands of the matter. "Do what you think is necessary. Just keep me in the loop." He sank back into his chair, folding his arms and staring at the table, a sullen figure dwarfed by the momentum he'd lost. As the meeting adjourned, the room buzzed with quiet conversations. David packed his briefcase, but before he could leave, a small group of attendees approached him. Lisa was first, extending a hand with a faint smile. "That was gutsy," she said, her tone warm with respect. "I should have spoken up sooner, I'm sorry you had to carry that alone. Can I get a copy of your simulation code? I want to run it by my team tonight." David shook her hand, returning a small nod. "No need to apologize. I'll send it over, let me know if you need help setting it up." He handed her a business card, its edges slightly worn, a relic of his quieter consulting days. Next came Colonel Reynolds, his handshake firm and brisk. "Good work, Chen," he said gruffly. "I remember your name from the old days, Trump's team, right? You've still got it. I'll need your input on the military side of this, expect a call tomorrow." David nodded again, filing away the request in his mental checklist. A third figure lingered, a junior official named Tom Carter, barely 30, with nervous energy radiating from him. "Dr. Chen, I just wanted to say I agree with you, he stammered, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting Johnson to overhear. I've seen some chatter on the dark web that matches what you described. I didn't know it was this serious. I'll dig deeper and send you what I find. David offered a rare, faint smile. Thanks, Tom. Every piece helps. Keep me posted. The young man beamed, clearly relieved to have his support acknowledged, and hurried off to join the others filing out of the room. As the crowd thinned, David slung his briefcase over his shoulder and headed for the door. The hallway felt lighter than when he'd arrived, the weight of the confrontation lifting with each step. But he knew this was only the beginning. The urgency Lisa and Reynolds had pushed for would spark action, but it was rushed, too rushed, perhaps, to fully plug the gap he'd exposed. Johnson's initial resistance had cost them precious time, and David couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the clock was still ticking faster than anyone realized. Back in the meeting room, Johnson sat alone for a moment, staring at the blank screen where David's simulation had played out. His assistants had scurried off to follow Lisa's lead, leaving him with the bitter taste of a defeat he couldn't spin. He muttered something under his breath, curse or complaint, it didn't matter, and grabbed his coat, storming out with the air of a man determined to reclaim his authority elsewhere. In the hours that followed, the technical team scrambled into action. Lisa led a small group of engineers in a basement server ascendancy labs, pulling an all-nighter to draft a preliminary patch based on David's data. Colonel Reynolds rallied a parallel effort at the Pentagon, barking orders to secure military servers. Tom Carter, true to his word, combed through dark web forums, flagging chatter that corroborated David's warnings. By midnight, a rough plan was in place, far from perfect, but enough to buy time if the worst came to pass. David, meanwhile, drove home through the quiet D.C. streets, the city lights blurring past his window. He didn't feel victorious, only tired, and faintly uneasy. The meeting had forced a crack in the wall of denial, but cracks could widen or collapse under pressure. He'd done his part, now it was up to them. As he pulled into his driveway, he glanced at his phone, no messages yet. Good, he thought. No news might mean they were still working. Or it might mean they were already too late. Part 5, Conclusion and Lessons Learned. The days following the meeting slipped by in a blur of quiet tension. David Chen returned to his routine in Virginia, splitting his time between consulting gigs and coaching his son through chess moves over dinner. The flurry of activity he'd sparked at the Department of Homeland Security felt distant, a storm he'd weathered and left behind. But the unease never fully left him. He checked his phone more often than usual, half expecting a call from Lisa Harper or Colonel Reynolds with updates, or worse, bad news. For 2 weeks, though, the line stayed silent, and he began to hope the rushed patch efforts had held the line. That hope shattered on April 7, 2025. David was sipping coffee in his kitchen, scrolling through news alerts on his tablet, when the headline hit, Massive Cyberattack Disrupts U.S. Banking Systems. His stomach dropped. The article detailed a coordinated assault that had struck overnight, targeting the Federal Reserve's payment networks and several major banks. Transactions froze, ATMs went dark, and panicked reports flooded social media. The attackers had exploited a vulnerability in the authentication protocols, exactly the one David had warned about. He set the mug down, hands trembling slightly, and dialed Lisa. She picked up on the second ring, her voice clipped and exhausted. David, you've seen it? She asked, skipping pleasantries. Yeah, he replied, keeping his tone steady despite the sinking feeling in his chest. How bad is it? Bad, she said. They got in before we could deploy the full patch. It's chaos, billions frozen, some data compromised. We mitigated the worst thanks to your heads up, but it's still a mess. I've been up all night with the team trying to contain it. David pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling slowly. Anything I can do? Stay by your phone, Lisa said. We might need you to consult on the cleanup. I'll keep you posted. She hung up, leaving him with the hum of the dial tone and a bitter mix of vindication and regret. The attack dominated headlines for days. By the time the dust settled, the damage tallied up to $12 billion in frozen assets, countless disrupted transactions, and a breach of low-level government data, thankfully not the classified files David had feared most. The patch Lisa's team had rushed into place after the meeting had blunted the attack's full potential, preventing a total collapse of the financial system or a deeper penetration into military networks. But the cost was still staggering, and the public outcry was deafening. Congressional hearings were called, and fingers pointed in every direction. An internal investigation followed, its findings leaked to the press by mid-April. The report was scathing, zeroing in on Undersecretary Harold Johnson's initial dismissal of David's warnings. Emails and meeting transcripts painted a damning picture. Johnson's arrogance had delayed critical action, leaving the government scrambling to catch up when the attack hit. The report didn't mince words, calling his leadership reckless and a failure of judgment. By the end of the month, Johnson quietly tendered his resignation, his career in tatters. Rumors swirled that he'd retreated to a golf course in Maryland, dodging reporters and nursing his wounded pride. For David, the fallout was bittersweet. He watched the news unfold from the sidelines, fielding calls from Lisa and Colonel Reynolds as they pieced together the recovery. The attack validated every word he'd said in that meeting, but the victory felt hollow. He hadn't wanted to be right, not like this, not with millions of people caught in the crossfire. Late one night, as he sat alone in his dimly lit study, he replayed the confrontation with Johnson in his mind. Could he have pushed harder? Spoken louder? He'd done everything by the book, yet the outcome still stung. A week after Johnson's resignation, David received an unexpected email from the Department of Homeland Security. It was an invitation to join a special advisory panel tasked with preventing future cyberattacks, a role that would pull him back into the government fold, albeit temporarily. The message was signed by a new interim undersecretary, a woman named Margaret Ortiz, who'd taken Johnson's place. Her note was brief but direct: "Your expertise is needed now more than ever. We can't afford another miss." David stared at the screen for a long time, the cursor blinking in the reply field. Part of him wanted to say no, to retreat back to his quiet life, away from the bureaucracy and egos that had nearly cost the country dearly. But another part, the one that had driven him to speak up in that meeting, wouldn't let him walk away. He typed a short response: "I'm in. Let's talk details." And hit send, sealing his return to the fray. The panel convened its first session in early May, a mix of cybersecurity experts, military brass, and tech industry leaders. David sat at the table, his voice steady as he outlined strategies to shore up the nation's defenses. Lisa was there too, her sharp mind cutting through the jargon to propose actionable fixes. Colonel Reynolds brought a gruff pragmatism, hammering home the need for speed and redundancy. Together, they built a framework that would have seemed impossible in the stagnant air of Johnson's meeting room, a testament to what could happen when expertise was heard instead of ignored. Months later, as summer faded into fall, the scars of the attack began to heal. The financial system stabilized, bolstered by new safeguards rooted in David's original analysis. The advisory panel's work earned quiet praise in security circles, though it rarely made the headlines, the kind of success measured in disasters averted rather than ribbons cut. David stepped back from the panel in September, content to let younger voices carry the torch. He returned to Virginia, his son's chess games, and the solace of a job well done. Reflecting on it all, David often thought back to that March day in the meeting room. The lesson wasn't just about cybersecurity, though that was critical. It was about arrogance, how it blinded people like Johnson to the truth, turning warnings into white noise until it was too late. It was about the quiet power of expertise, the way it could shift a room when backed by data and resolve. And it was about listening, really listening, to those who knew, even when their voices didn't fit the narrative or flatter the ego. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, David's phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "Just ran your simulation again for training," it read. "Still gives me chills. Thanks for not giving up." He smiled faintly, typing back, "Just glad it's a lesson now, not a headline." He set the phone down and leaned back, the weight of the past months easing into something like peace. The story of that meeting, and the attack that followed, became a cautionary tale in government corridors and tech circles alike. It underscored a simple truth: pride could topple empires, but humility and respect for knowledge could save them. For David Chen, it was a reminder of why he'd stepped into that room in the first place, not for glory, but for the chance to make a difference, one stubborn stand at a time. And there you have it, folks, the final curtain falls on this breathtaking chapter of Heartfelt Tales, but the echoes of this story are still ringing in our ears. From the clash of wills in that fateful meeting room to the chilling aftermath of a cyber attack that could have been stopped, we've peeled back the layers of a drama that's as real as it gets. David Chen stood tall against the storm, a lone voice drowned out by arrogance, until the truth roared back with a vengeance, shaking the foundations of power and leaving a nation to pick up the pieces. But what's the takeaway? Pride can blind, expertise can save, and every second of hesitation can cost us dearly. You've made it to the end of this roller coaster, and trust me, if you skipped a single beat, you'd have missed the heart of it all. So, what's racing through your mind right now? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Did Johnson's downfall shock you? Did David's grit inspire you? Hit that like button if this tale gripped you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Heartfelt Tales, because we're just getting warmed up with stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. This isn't goodbye, it's a see you next time, so ring that bell, stick around, and let's keep the conversation alive. Until then, stay curious, stay bold, and keep feeling the heartbeat of every tale we bring your way.